in any hype cycle, what's the underlying truth? I think with AI, this is real. There is something here that's really important that does seem like a generational technology shift.
I'm Ronan Burke.
I'm Conor Burke.
I'm Brie Valesky, and this is Good Question, a brand new podcast about LLMs, AI agents, and ChatGPT prompts from your friends at Inscribe. Conor, Ronan, welcome to the very first episode of our podcast. I know we've already shared our names, but do you want to give a little bit more of an introduction about each of yourselves so that our audience can have some context?
Sure, happy to. So I'm Ronan, and Conor's my twin. We founded Inscribe about 7 years ago, based on an experience Conor had at a bank. And yeah, we've been working together since then, building Inscribe, solving challenges that operations teams at financial service companies face. And yeah, a lot more to talk about there, but that's a brief intro from my side. Conor, I'll let you elaborate a little bit more about the experience you had that set us out on this journey.
Yeah, this project at a national bank in Ireland was my first-hand experience at the challenges risk teams go through when implementing fraud, credit, or compliance automation software, and really gave me a lot of empathy for what our customers are going through, but also was the spark and initial motivation for us to try to tackle this problem.
I love how you highlighted customer empathy, because that is really something that's at the core of everything we do at Inscribe. And just to round it off, I'm Brie, head of marketing. My background is actually in journalism, but I also have 10 plus years of experience on B2B revenue teams. I love asking good questions, and I'm also very passionate about helping fraud fighters and risk leaders adopt AI at scale. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, our podcast is also called Good Question. That's because the introduction of LLMs into not just industry, but also society has really given everyone the ability to use AI in their personal and professional lives by simply coming up with compelling prompts, which are often in the form of questions. And the better your questions are, the better results you often get. But we're also going to ask a lot of good questions on this podcast, because even if we don't always have the answers, a good question almost always leads to an interesting discussion. And today, we're going to talk about one of the biggest questions on almost everyone's mind right now. Is AI worth the hype? This will be a fun question to explore because I think we all saw the market on such a bull run with interest and investments in AI in the first half of this year. But now we've seen some big industry players like Goldman Sachs, Sequoia, and others really question the value and share more bearish points of view. Conor, Ronan, what are your thoughts? Is AI worth the hype? Are we in an AI bubble? And why are people suddenly so concerned with this question?
Yeah, I can get started there. I think with all kind of tech cycles, people tend to always ask, where are we in the hype cycle? But it's generally a well understood thing with various different stages in it. You have the tech trigger, you have the peak of inflated expectations, then you have the trough of disillusionment, slope of enlightenment, and then the plateau of productivity when things kind of reach stability. These questions are often asked with big tech changes and big changes in the world in general about people understanding, where are we on this curve? Because depending where you are on the curve, you might make different decisions. And so from that, you can kind of ask the question, like, is there value in asking the question? And what's the point of asking the question? And more precisely, is it valuable to know where in the hype cycle we are? And what decisions would you make differently from that? You can kind of even pose the question of every moment in time during a big tech shift, we should have a good answer here. Conor, I'll hand it over to you to kind of give an opinion perhaps on where are we in the cycle. Key to that is that it is an opinion. It's hard to have perfect data on it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
One is what role you play within the ecosystem, and the second is the hype worth it or is it real? And just on the first part, what role you play in the ecosystem? Like, are you an investor? Are you a builder? Are you a consumer? Are you a buyer? You need to be wise to the reality and understand the risks involved. So, for example, if you're an investor, you obviously need to be quite optimistic about the bets you're making. Not you go in with the expectation of not all going to work, and that's okay, but some will. But perhaps, let's say, if you're a buyer for a large enterprise company, you need to be more sure with where you're placing your bets in certain vendors or certain software projects. And yeah, with that responsibility, you need to understand some of the limitations and expectations with AI and what it can do. I think the second part then for me is, in any hype cycle, is there something true, or what's the underlying truth? And I think with AI, this is real. There is something here that's really important that does seem like a generational technology shift, just like semiconductors, just like the internet, that I think it is worth betting on. So I don't think us as an industry, we need to get too worried or hand wringing about, will this all collapse, or like will the hype come to an end? Given the, over the long term, I think we will eventually reach this end state where we will see the value. So yeah, if the different players in the industry are cognizant and wise of the expectations and realities, I think we'll end up in a good spot.
Nice. I think that is a perfect introduction to the entire conversation we're going to have on this episode. I did mention that this podcast was about ChatGPT prompts. So what do you guys think about asking ChatGPT if we're in an AI bubble right now?
Nice, let's do it.
Yeah, it may be a bit biased, but let's see what we get.
I want to know if it's biased. I'm very curious.
Let me share my screen and we can see what we get.
Nice.
So, are we in an AI bubble? I'm curious to see if it searches other sources or if it's internally generated. Okay.
And what's interesting about this is like where it's kind of, what this model was trained on and when, depending on when the model was trained and what the media and content available online.
I like how it's broke down its structure. So yeah, arguments suggesting we might be in an AI bubble: overvaluation of AI companies, excessive hype and media coverage, limited understanding and misuse of AI, speculative investments. Yeah, I would say that's all those are true. And then on the counter arguments, fundamental advancement, yes, I strongly agree with that. Broad adoption across industries. I don't think we've maybe seen the level of adoption to suggest this is true just yet. Long-term potential, yes, absolutely. Sustained investment from major players. Yeah, I'd say that's largely true as well. So conclusion, it suggests here whether or not we're in an AI bubble is difficult to determine. There's strong signs for and against. As with any rapidly evolving technology, caution is warranted, but dismissing AI as mere hype would likely be short-sighted given its transformation. Yeah, I think that's a pretty measured response.
I was going to say, it's a very balanced perspective. It's calling out first that like, hey, whether we're in a bubble, it's pretty nuanced. Here are some arguments you could make to say we are in a bubble, but also here are some arguments and data points you could look at to say we're not in a bubble right now.
So yeah, if we were to maybe ask it another question, what would happen if the bubble burst? I don't want to be too negative in my thinking here. I am long-term positive and I don't think the bubble is going to burst, but it's interesting nonetheless to ask an AI about that or end states.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think it's highlighting a lot of the things that you would see in the normal bursting of a bubble, so to speak. Financial implications, like valuations for AI companies would decrease, slower pace of development, economic impacts such as job losses, and potentially an innovation reset. So again, a balanced take, kind of saying like a bursting of the bubble, so to speak, would cause significant disruption, but it also could be sort of like a market correction and sort of a way to refresh the approach to AI overall.
Yeah. And I think when bubbles burst, they're generally net negative for society. So I think this does highlight a good point around doing our best today to educate the market and the various parties on the realities and the right expectations to have to avoid such a bubble. So yeah, hopefully we can achieve elements of that throughout this podcast and educate our users and other stakeholders on the current state and, what's working, ways and working, and avoid this kind of innovation reset or setback.
Definitely. I'm curious to see how it would respond to a question on like what causes overhyped, industries, or what causes bubbles to begin with, because my initial thought would just be sort of a outsized level of excitement, but for an AI that doesn't really have emotions or experience them as data, I'm interested to see how it would respond if we ask. So it talks about excessive speculation, herd behavior, FOMO. That's really funny. Low interest rates, so you get cheap money, leverage investments, just constant iteration coming out. So with every new development, I mean, I think the introduction of ChatGPT itself, of course, probably contributed to the hype cycle. And it's just interesting to look at all of these different factors, because I don't think any one or two of them alone would contribute to it. But it's when you start to get 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 that then you start to see the media hype come in, and the euphoria and overconfidence that it's mentioning, or even government incentives. So, Ronan, what are your thoughts?
I mean, yeah, what I take away from this response is ChatGPT is pretty good at providing like pretty good summary of generally what's available on public literature, and does a pretty good job here of thinking about all the bases. And what's difficult as a human or as an individual is when given a question, how do you actually approach it from all the correct or optimal angles? And that's actually pretty tricky to do. As one person, if you're particularly familiar with a domain, you can do that. But for a new domain, new question, it's tricky to cover all those bases. But ChatGPT here does a really good job of that. As humans, we often need to work in teams to provide such a comprehensive answer. So when I look at this answer here of what leads to a hype cycle, I think it's pretty good. One thing I'd add in addition to what ChatGPT provides is just like the time horizon. Oftentimes, hype and bubbles, they can be warranted, but sometimes timing is a kind of key determining factor. And so like crypto would be another example where, the underlying technology there will likely be useful for a lot of industries and domains over the long term, but we could be talking about a 10, 50-year time horizon. We don't know how long it'll be, but it is and likely was a lot longer than people thought in 2020, 2021. And with AI, we don't know what kind of time horizon all of this value add will play out. But oftentimes, bubbles and hype cycles occur because people are kind of betting that it'll happen sooner rather than later and trying to make a risk-adjusted decision based on that. But yeah, I think the ChatGPT provided a pretty good response here.
Very interesting, in-depth response. And to your point, Ronan, how does it come up with this sort of detailed, objective response? Myself as a journalist, if I was asked that question, I would do a lot of research. I'd interview subject matter experts. I'd do my own Googling and reading, and then try to collate those insights. But what's amazing about LLMs is that it can do all of that in just a matter of milliseconds and collect all the information from the entire world off the internet and spit out an answer. So it's just amazing to see this technology.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
Cool. All right. Last question. I want to know if ChatGPT, what it thinks is overhyped right now, if anything. Want to see if I can push an opinion out of it. Okay.
Then we have the metaverse. Oh, electric vehicles. NFTs. Quantum computing. Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay.
Ooh.
Space tourism. 5G technology.
That's so interesting.
Getting controversial now. Wearable technology, smart home technology, virtual reality.
Wow, there's a lot more.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Very interesting.
Did it mention autonomous driving?
No.
Ask it if it thinks autonomous driving is overhyped. It'd be funny if it gave an opinion it's not. It seems like a glaring omission.
Yeah, it wasn't as comprehensive as we were complimenting on it on a couple of months ago. But I think what's maybe an important point to note here is just a useful role hype does play. Hype allows the world to become more aware of technologies before they're ready, and allows for investment when investment otherwise wouldn't be available, and encourages talent to swarm to certain technologies. I think it's when hype goes too far and we have bubbles and the bubbles burst is when they're a negative for society. But if hype is allocated correctly or appropriately, it can actually be quite useful.
So hype, the way I kind of think about it is the equivalent of pressure. So high stakes and pressure is actually good for increasing individuals' performance and productivity. And similar for a new technology, a certain level of hype is actually good to get it off the ground. But if it's too much hype and leads to a bubble, it can actually be a setback. And the equivalent of an individual would be burnout. So you don't want to put so much pressure on somebody who works so hard and they burn out because there's recovery time then. But with a hype cycle, for reasons you mentioned, it can be beneficial. And so maybe the most valuable question we could be asking here is, let's monitor hype and don't let it get to a point where it's a bubble. I don't know, there's no central authority that controls hype and bubbles, but something just as an industry to be aware of.
I thought that's Twitter's job. Huh?
Yeah, exactly. Another interesting thing to note here with the ChatGPT response here is that like the list of 10 things it said was overhyped, and then the additional prompt of autonomous driving. This isn't objective in that like it's not really even an opinion. It's that's kind of backed up by a particular person. It's just like information, and it's not a conclusive, exhaustive, correct list, and there's no authority backing it up. So that needs to be taken into account when asking these questions. And just because something isn't on here doesn't mean it's not true in terms of the question that we pose to it.
That's true. Where's ChatGPT's editor before its stuff gets published? Super interesting. Well, I think we can say goodbye to ChatGPT for now and potentially turn our attention to what some other humans have to say about the hype. First, let's start with David Kahn. He is a partner at Sequoia Capital, and he says the AI bubble is reaching a tipping point in his article, which is titled AI's $600 billion question. So according to David, the revenue gap between expected and actual AI infrastructure returns has grown from $200 billion in 2023 to $600 billion in 2024. Some of the reasons why that he highlights are, one, OpenAI is leading in AI revenue by a wide margin, growing from, $1.5 billion last year to now $3.5 billion, leaving a gap for other startups to want to realize that revenue. And while David says you could argue that GPU CapEx is like building railroads and that eventually the trains will come, as will the destinations, he points out that speculative investment frenzies do often lead to high rates of capital incineration and that many people can lose a lot of money. So that seems to be his good question. Where and when will we see the $600 billion return in revenue from all these AI investments that have already been made? I think this article itself is mainly targeted toward other investors or VC firms, but Ronan, would you agree with any of his sentiments?
It is a good question. I think what comes to mind immediately here is just that with all new technologies, there is an element of like, how do you time this? And how much investment do you kind of put in beforehand and before you see a return, and how long do you kind of want to wait for that? And so, the bigger the potential and promise and, the expected value, like maybe the longer term time horizon you can take. And I think that's a lot of investors and a lot of companies are kind of thinking at the moment, is that like, this is such a large shift in like the underlying technology and an improvement. And that's going to lead to a huge amount of productivity gains and economic growth, that they're happy to make a huge amount of investment and have a long time horizon for receiving the return here. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind. And the second thing is, that's like answering like the when question. But then for the where question, I think one thing that is interesting about like the 600 billion that has been invested, I don't think the return will come from everything that was invested in. Like the 600 billion won't be returned in proportion to the investment allocations. For example, it could be the case that 600 billion is invested in 800 companies or thereabouts. But like, for all we know, OpenAI could return 400 billion of that, and then 200 billion then is spread across the next 100. And I think another point to make here as well is that on the when question is, this isn't a question of like dollar in, a dollar back immediately. It's like, dollar in and you might get a dollar back at some unknown point in the future. It's not a simple kind of the timing question. Everybody needs to make their own decisions on when they expect a return, but that's made on a kind of individual or business case.
Nice. Yeah, the time horizon is such an interesting question and concept too, because we do live in such a world of fast iteration and innovation. And so maybe that erroneously makes us think that the return on our investments are going to be equally as fast, lightning fast, just in the way we're seeing AI technology evolve. Conor, what are your thoughts?
A lot of the onus is on investors to make these decisions over the cycle, and I don't envy them. It is a difficult decision. Some new consumer behaviors go to emerge that we can never imagine would produce billions of dollars of value, and then there's maybe obvious behaviors or applications of LLMs and AI where we would assume there'd be billions of dollars of value, but then that may not materialize. So I think in terms of our expectations on getting this return, I think over the short term, there will definitely be some winners and losers. But I think in long term, as you're hinting at, Ronan, the market will in general benefit usually from this, and the GDP of economies will likely be affected.
Yeah, it's very interesting to just think about like the risk of investing in AI. Risk is a field that we're obviously very familiar with. And so then thinking about all the different data points and timeframes and ways of looking at something to understand the potential risk is such a meaty topic that I think we could probably spend the rest of the episode on. But I do want to bring up one more piece of research that came out of Goldman Sachs. It's about Gen AI in particular. And it's touching kind of the same question, where the report itself is titled Gen AI, Too Much Spend, Too Little Benefit. And I said it like that because it is a question, the way the report is titled. But in this report, they cite, big tech companies like Microsoft, Google, Meta, and Amazon. They're projected to spend over $1 trillion on AI infrastructure in the coming years. This includes investments that span the gamut, data centers, chips, other necessary infrastructure to support AI advancements. And despite the substantial investment, there is, skepticism coming from these analysts as well at Goldman about the economic benefits of generative AI. An analyst from MIT in the report actually predicts only a limited increase in productivity and GDP growth from AI over the next decade. Ronan, would you agree with that?
I find it hard to believe. I'd definitely be more optimistic on that. But, again, I don't really know too much about the report or, the folks who wrote it. But it's so difficult to predict this. And if they can accurately predict it, fair play to them. But it's an interesting kind of prediction because you can just do for or against. You have a 50% chance if you just want to do it randomly. But yeah, I just think it's so unlikely for anybody to predict it right now, either way. And if anything, based on the previous tech shifts, I think more folks than not are probably on the for side that it is going to lead to more economic gains and the investments being put into it. So, but as with all these things in a kind of well-functioning society, it's always good to have checks and balances and people kind of giving opinions on both sides of the fence. So it probably brings a healthy level of skepticism, and it might go towards helping folks thinking about these investments more robustly. And then, as we were talking about earlier, help prevent us from getting overhyped and entering into a bubble. It's this kind of perspective that keeps us kind of sensible with how we're approaching it.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because my first gut reaction when I read that is like, gosh, I feel like the productivity gains in my professional life and in my personal life, just from even using ChatGPT alone, have already been enormous. But to your point, we need to stay grounded when we're looking at these advancements and trying to predict the future, so to speak. And so having this level of skepticism, having these different points of view really helps contribute to that. And again, is like a hedge against the hype. So last part of this report is really in it. Goldman's head of global equity research also asks the $1 trillion question, if you will, which is, what $1 trillion problem will AI solve? And his point of view is that replacing low-wage jobs with tremendously costly tech is basically the polar opposite of prior technology transitions that he says he's witnessed in his 30 years of following the tech industry. And to justify the extraordinary high costs of these $1 trillion of investments that these companies are making, AI must be able to solve complex problems. Conor, what are your thoughts on that?
Generally, my perspective is that the cost of AI and running LLMs from a training inference perspective is coming down so fast that I think it's way too early to have such a strong statement that it will not be able to do a lot of valuable work for people today. In terms of, will this be able to capture $1 trillion of value? Based on my personal experience of using AI or ChatGPT in my personal life and within Inscribe and the impact it's having on our customers already, if our forecast is over 10 years, I definitely do think this will be, multi-billion and perhaps even $1 trillion impact on society. And it's, definitely as big as a semiconductor industry or and like internet revolution. So would feel maybe more optimistic than this report is outlining. But yeah, just based on what we're seeing firsthand, but also the trend of cost reducing, I'd feel a little bit more optimistic than what this report is saying.
Nice. I agree. And I think that's such a key point that you highlighted. It feels like every single day, the performance that we're seeing from these LLMs and AI agents is increasing and the cost of them is decreasing. So maybe there's just a little bit of a flywheel at the beginning where there's like a lot of upfront investment, but slowly over time, again, the time horizon, I'm still a little more than cautiously optimistic that we're going to receive the gains from those investments. Okay, well, it's time for our lightning round. What is something that each of you think is overhyped right now?
I had a recent experience of going through an airport and was sold on a product that claims to speed you through security, but was also learned the difference between TSA PreCheck and this other provider. I quickly realized that perhaps this other provider is a little bit overhyped. I was initially very eager to sign up for this fast way of getting through airport security, but I realized it was actually slower than the TSA PreCheck.
I might have been the person that overhyped it.
Yeah.
But it's sometimes that queue is actually even longer than the normal queue that doesn't have the expedited thing. So it's like, when more people pay for the expedited queue than are in the normal queue, like it's not expedited anymore.
So strong feelings about that one at the moment, having recently gone through it.
Nice. All right, Ronan, what's overhyped for you right now?
We asked ChatGPT this question earlier, and we had a good few kind of decent and good answers, and I'd only be regurgitating those.
Garlic?
Potentially.
Okay,
my mind immediately goes to just technologies, but if we are allowed to include food items, I mean, that opens up a whole new world of possibilities. So. Can I do underhyped?
Sure.
I think the world needs to know about your hatred of garlic now.
Yeah.
I think garlic is appropriately hyped, and I'm sorry you had a bad garlic experience, Ronan. What do you think is underhyped right now?
So yeah, I think underhyped, maybe it's an age-old thing that's been well understood for years, but I recently moved apartment, and thinking about sunlight and the orientation and where your kind of the windows in your home are facing, I don't think enough people talk about it when choosing where to live. And yeah, and then maybe a little bit of a sub point to that is like the view from those windows. I think it's like the single most important characteristic of finding somewhere new to live. Up there with location of the actual property. I think it has a huge impact on well-being and how the overall kind of quality of life in that particular place is. So I don't think enough people talk about it or consider it. And, especially when people are building homes and apartment blocks, I mean, if you 4 sides to a building, you can't have them all south-facing, obviously. But there are other ways you can architecturally kind of influence it with offset windows and then angles and so on. So I'd say that's underhyped.
Nice. I do know that architects do take that into consideration, but I couldn't agree more, actually. I have one big window in my apartment space, and what's really important to me is I can see trees and greenery and like a nice open sky. So I need that nature in my life.
Maybe a product across here for Zillow is having a orientation summary when you're when you see the price, number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, but you've no orientation or even hours of sunlight per day or number of faces with windows or number of windows even or square meters of glass. I think Zillow has an opportunity there.
When Zillow builds their AI real estate agent or whoever builds the AI real estate agent, take note, we need to know number and position and dimensions of windows and amount of sunlight. Okay, I'll wrap it up. My overhyped thing is Gladiator 2 because the original was perfect and we don't need a sequel. And that's all I'm going to say about that. All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. We will make sure to include all of the articles that we cited and referenced in the show notes. Hope you all laughed a lot, learned a lot, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Ira.
Ronan, do you ever sing?
No,
Oh, no.
never.
Never? All right, that's fine.
Connor and I were removed from our communion or confirmation. The whole class was singing, and we were asked not to sing because we were so bad.
No.
And keep the answer short too, Connor. Like, I mean, like you could have ended it right there, and we can just move on.
Okay. So, which part was particularly long?
All of it. Like,
Okay, let's keep it short. Okay. I'll keep it short.
You could have ended it like
It's
70%.
We want to keep this snappy.